It's a little after 1 p.m., and you've tuned in to New Health Radio on KMUZ 88.5 FM. We're actually broadcasting live today, but we will not be taking telephone calls. On this edition of New Health Radio, we are privileged to have Liz Rogers back in studio. Liz is the co-producer of a new documentary, which is soon to be released. It is entitled Hot Water, and it reveals the very dirty and dangerous side of nuclear power and uranium mining in the United States. Liz, it's a pleasure to have you back in studio. The last time you were here was October 30th, almost 2 months ago. Since then, I know you've been on tour promoting your documentary. Could you briefly summarize the background behind your documentary for some of our newer listeners and bring us up to speed on what's been happening over the past 2 months with regard to uranium mining and legal issues? And I know you spent a lot of time on the East Coast over the past 2 months.
I have, and thank you so much for having me back. It's such a joy to be here and support KMUZ. You guys are amazing and do such a great job. Hot Water, documentary about specifically uranium mining and the environmental impact that it has on our groundwater, air, and soil. Very few of us consider the front end of the nuclear energy cycle. And this specifically addresses that, although we do go into nuclear energy and the health and economic impacts of it. Primarily, the film addresses the kinds of things that we have done historically through uranium mining and are continuing to do today.
So we normally think, when we think in terms of nuclear power, we think in terms of these big concrete stacks. That's kind of where our imagination is kind of limited to,
Right.
With regard to, some little nuclear fireball happening inside of them. But we don't really think about all of the ore mining that happens throughout the entire United States, digging up ground, releasing radioactive material in order to then mine it and concentrate it for use in those reactors.
Exactly right. That uranium comes from, obviously comes from the mining process in areas, particularly in the American West. There are some areas in the East Coast that have significant uranium deposits that have been discovered. Virginia is one, which I know we'll discuss as we go. Digging up this ore has been a serious issue for nearly, oh my gosh, it could be going on 100 years since the properties of uranium were discovered early on in Europe.
Before they were even used for nuclear power.
Exactly. So releasing this ore, which has been buried underground for millennia and has allowed us to be safe from it for the most part, has been dug up and released into our air, soil, and water, and is very underregulated. And even the regulations that are in place to protect us from it are very, very difficult to enforce because the kinds of illnesses that this radiation exposure causes.
So what are some of those illnesses?
Oh my gosh, well, cancer, first and foremost.
Like leukemia?
Cancers, leukemia, the kinds of ionizing radiation that you're exposed to through this affects your filter systems. So lungs, pancreas, thyroid, cesium in particular attaches to muscle tissue, the heart, the thyroid gland, leukemias, cancers, esophageal, pancreatic, kidney cancers, stomach cancers, lung cancers, very, very strange and rare brain cancers.
So once this is released from the ground, it can find its way into our water supply, and there's no way of really removing it effectively. And if it's a very dry and arid climate, then it could actually become airborne, where people can then respirate it.
Absolutely. If it's in the water, it will get into your food supply, whether that food is grain or if it's the meat. So one of the things that we discovered in filming was that in areas where some of these mines have been left abandoned for decades, there are farmers there who raise cattle, raise the hay to feed their cattle using the water that's run off from these areas. So you could be eating a steak from a cow who was raised literally eating that grain, drinking that water, living and sleeping on that soil that's contaminated. So that animal could be full of ionizing radiation, but also the byproducts, arsenic, ammonia, molybdenum, excessive amounts of molybdenum that's found in those areas.
So even if you tried to raise cattle organically and they were simply being raised on land that had this kind of contamination, you would still be eating meat that was highly dangerous for your health.
Absolutely, absolutely, unless you tested for it. The FDA does not test for that.
And do organic guidelines test for that?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Not that I'm aware of, and I would need to qualify that
Sure.
because I would have to check that out. But pardon me. Now, in the case of the food supply and the impact from Japan, there is, in Fukushima, there is more of a pressure on the FDA to do some checking of some of the import products in food, but not our domestic food supply.
So talk to me about some of the stuff that I know, just looking at the Facebook page, there were some legal battles that were going on over the past 2 months on the East Coast with a Virginia uranium mine, Bethesda. It looks like Bethesda Power is now planning on filing bankruptcy. I don't know if it's the exact name of the company, but it was like Bethesda Power Company or Bethesda Uranium Mining.
Right. Virginia Uranium is a Canadian company who wants to mine what they say is 119 million pounds of low-grade uranium ore in Virginia. There are a handful of nonprofit organizations, environmental organizations who have been fighting them. Virginia has had a 30-year moratorium on uranium mining in that area because of the amount of water that Virginia has. 43 inches of rainfall a year, very, very shallow water table. And Virginia Uranium, a Canadian company, partnered with Walter Coles and Coles Hill in Virginia, where this uranium ore is located, to try to overturn the moratorium and begin mining in Virginia.
And the rationale in the moratorium was that the water table was so shallow, and because there was enough rain, that any radioactive material could easily be dispersed throughout the rest of the country.
Through the water supply.
I'm sorry, throughout the rest of the state.
Throughout the rest of the state, and millions of people get their water, particularly Richmond, Virginia Beach, well over 1 million people get their water from the downflow from that area.
Right.
So there has been a long ongoing battle against great odds. They have millions of dollars into this deal, lobbying, dozens of full-time paid lobbyists in Richmond trying to get this opened up. And fortunately, the new governor of Virginia, Governor McAuliffe, was able to review the information that the Keep the Ban group, We the People of Virginia, the Sierra Club, and other organizations had put together, and said, no, it's not going to happen. We're not going to let this moratorium be lifted.
Well, it strikes me as both odd and somewhat dangerous on a national level to have a company outside that's not owned by our own citizens to mine something that could be a national disaster, potentially.
Exactly right.
Especially if they can simply leave the states with no with no kind of legal responsibility if they so chose.
And no consequences.
Exactly.
Exactly. They would take the money and run, basically, okay? That may sound a little harsh, but it is absolutely the truth.
So there's no legal provision in place to prevent foreign businesses from simply mining uranium in the United States?
The Canadian mining companies have been the ones to do most of the uranium mining in the United States. Okay. Many of them filed bankruptcy and walked away. In the case of Moab, Utah, where we have 16 million tons of radioactive waste sitting on the banks of the Colorado River, open, in an unlined gravel pit less than 700 feet from the banks of the Colorado River. And it's been there for 50 years.
And all that just flows downstream.
Flows downstream. 38 million people get their water from the Colorado River.
So-
And it's been like that for 50 years. And when Atlas Mining found out they were going to have to clean up the groundwater at the site, they filed bankruptcy and walked away.
So is that a common strategy, just to reduce not only operational costs, because it would seem that if they're really savvy and there's no legal repercussions, you could just do that as basically a business strategy, which is start a mining business, make a lot of money, and then once you get to the point to where you might have to be responsible for cleanup, you just file bankruptcy and walk away and let the taxpayers take care of it.
Exactly. It's much easier to ask for forgiveness than permission.
Right.
So they don't.
And then based on the way that we've currently set up corporations in the United States, and they weren't always this way. Around 100 years ago, corporate stockholders were actually personally responsible for any damages that company perpetrated on other individuals or other organizations. And over the past 100 years, legislation has been changed so that now corporate shareholders can actually be divorced from any of the responsibilities. And this would essentially allow, say, the owner of a mining company to make a lot of money on selling the ore, then file bankruptcy and not be responsible for anything and still maintain their personal wealth.
Absolutely. And this is the case with Kerr-McGee and Anadarko, which is the case you mentioned earlier about the Navajo Indians, where the Navajo land in New Mexico and Arizona was dramatically impacted by uranium mining. Earlier in our history, the mining companies paid people to load the rocks by hand and paid them by the truckload. They would bring them in the back of their truck or horse-drawn wagon and pay them by the pound for this uranium ore. Many Navajo people built the foundations for their homes from these rocks.
Oh, wow.
And it was an epidemic of horrific disease caused by the not just the ionizing radiation, but the radon gas emitted from this ore. I think we all remember the big kerfuffle years ago about radon gas in homes and radon detectors and such. Well, this is the kind of thing that comes up with uranium in the environment. Very toxic, very kidney toxic. Lung cancer and kidney cancer are a very, very high probability in those environments. And Kerr-McGee and Anadarko. Kerr-McGee, oh my gosh, how do we even begin to address that story? Kerr-McGee owned the uranium mine in the Black Hills, where we first started filming hot water.
Is that Nevada or Utah? Or
South Dakota.
South Dakota.
In South Dakota in the Black Hills. That's where we discovered the issue. And we followed the trail of Kerr-McGee as one of the mining companies down to Crescent, Oklahoma. The listeners who remember the film Silkwood in 1983 with Cher and Meryl Streep told the story of Karen Silkwood, who worked for the Cimarron plutonium processing plant and was pointing out safety violations at that plant, and ended up being coincidentally contaminated with plutonium in her home, and then was ultimately killed in a car accident, and Kerr-McGee was held liable for her death. Kerr-McGee has millions of dollars in environmental debt for all of the damage that they've caused in over 2,700 sites across the United States. Toxic waste sites. Not all uranium, but all of their other operations, including uranium mining. And they piled all of their environmental and tort debt onto one of their small subsidiaries, Tronox, and then sold themselves to Anadarko Petroleum and Oil for $21 billion cash. And the CEO of Kerr-McGee walked away with $200 million in cash. In the meantime, 8,000 investors in Tronox got stuck with all of this debt and had to file bankruptcy. Kerr-McGee walked away, That plant in Crescent, Oklahoma, has been sitting abandoned for 40 years, and they still haven't done any cleanup there. And there's a tremendous amount of waste buried on site, at that site. And not coincidentally, the distributor that we signed with on this film, there's a married couple who run the distribution company. And when Sean, the wife, saw the film, she called me and she said, "I saw it, I cried, I want it. And I want you to know that my husband was raised in Crescent, Oklahoma, near that plant, and he has leukemia."
Wow.
And so they are very emotionally involved in this. So that, of course, is an aside, but the impact of these mining companies who come in, take the ore, and walk away is an ongoing problem and will continue to be a problem because they cannot clean it up. Virginia Uranium claims that they have a new, quote, technology that will prevent groundwater from being contaminated, but they cannot guarantee.
Is that called in situ?
In situ leach mining?
Yes.
In situ leach mining is another process. There's open pit mining, which is, everybody kind of knows what that is. In situ leach mining is a process where they will drill a well down into the ore, and they will pump a combination of water and peroxide. It's almost like a toilet bowl cleaner, down into the ore, dissolve it, it turns into a liquid, an oxidized liquid, and then they pump it back out.
It sounds to me a lot like the fracking that they're doing with petroleum. It sounds like a very similar technique.
Very much so. In that case, they hydrofracking, or they pump water, and who knows if there is anything in the water or not. I'm not familiar with that, but
well, they too add chemicals to bind the petroleum that's naturally in the soil and in the sediment, and then they pull it back out again.
Right.
In the process, the whole water table gets contaminated, even though they publicly argue that it's perfectly safe and there's nothing wrong with it. And yet, locally, citizens are able to light their spigot water on fire with petroleum byproducts that are in their well water.
That's right. We had a doctor who, unfortunately, I was not able to interview in the way that they were able to in Gasland. If your listeners haven't seen Gasland or Gasland 2, which is the series of documentaries on the fracking, wonderfully done, beautifully done films. We have a doctor in South Dakota Nebraska, who lives near the Crow Butte mine, who says that when the mine's in operation, he has yellow water coming out of his tap. I was not able to get to him to interview him, and I wish I could have, for that very reason, because the impact of that is just so huge on a viewing audience to be able to see that. So I really regret that, but we don't have to have that to know and to get the results of all of the domestic well testing in all of these mining areas that show extremely high levels of contaminants in the water. Colorado, near the Canyon City processing plant, in many of these areas that we filmed all across the country, the results are specific and very, very firm.
Well, on a positive note, I saw something the other day regarding the Navajo Nation, and it seems that they at least won a legal battle against uranium.
Kerr-McGee and Anadarko.
Okay.
Yes.
So I'd like to talk just a little bit about that, and then I'd like to go to a brief break for community announcement. And so if you could just fill in the listeners just briefly on what's happened most recently with the Navajo Nation. I know they've encountered a lot of losses from leukemia, cancer.
Right. They have. The lawsuit against Kerr-McGee and Anadarko has been ongoing for the last couple of years. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, in the U.S. government, who had to take over the cleanup on these things, went in and sued Anadarko and Kerr-McGee for $25 billion. for walking away from this and for what they did with the Tronex stock fraud and all of those kinds of things. The Navajo Nation was part of, was on the plaintiff list for some of the damages that have been caused by Kerr-McGee's actions. And Kerr-McGee knew and Anadarko knew last year when the case came close to wrapping that they were not going to win. And it was very, very well published in the press. There was little hope they were going to get away with anything. They knew it was going to be a big, big problem. And it did come down. Navajo Nation, it was ruled in their favor and in the favor of all the other plaintiffs in that action. So at least the Navajo Nation will at some point get enough money to try to do some kind of reparations and take care of some of these horrific health problems that they've been left with.
Well, based on the news release, it appeared that they may receive somewhere in the realm of $5 billion to $14 billion as a settlement. Of course, I don't know how you can even put a number on loss of family and community. But again, that may make them responsible for literally bringing in the heavy equipment to clean this up, since the other companies aren't doing it.
If any of your listeners have ever been to a reservation, particularly Pine Ridge in South Dakota, which has been horrifically impacted, the reservations in New Mexico and Arizona, they are in worse condition than any third world country I've ever been to. China, on and on. I mean, it is unbelievable the kinds of conditions that we ask those people to live in. Bringing in the heavy equipment and bringing in some money, if it does nothing more than give them clean water to drink and an uncontaminated home to live in and clean air to breathe, hallelujah. We need to pay it. Absolutely. We need to pay it, period.
So, Liz, I know when you started your documentary, Hot Water, you had started in the Black Hills in South Dakota.
Right.
And then maybe 2 or 3 years in, that's when Fukushima happened. And you were very uniquely placed, with the research that you'd been doing to really understand the vast negative potential of Fukushima and how that could actually affect the West Coast. And of course, it's been about 3 years since that event has transpired. They're still wrestling with all kinds of issues. I know we touched on this briefly the last time you were in studio, but it seems to me that there's a lot of information that's been coming out. I know they're moving some spent fuel rods, and that could be very dangerous. David Suzuki, who's a Japanese biogeneticist and environmental scientist, I think he has something along the lines of 20-something honorary degrees. I mean, this guy is no academic
Big brain.
slouch. Yes. He's basically said, look, if there's another earthquake to hit that power plant while they're in the process of removing these rods, which could take an entire year to do, if not longer, he said literally, bye-bye West Coast of the United States.
Exactly, yes.
So, and it seems to me, too, that it looks like there might even be kind of an iron wall of secrecy being erected, so we don't even really know what's coming as far as the information that's being publicly shared through major media channels, how accurate it actually is. Are you aware of any information, and is there something that you could share with us and the listeners?
The problems with Fukushima and the decommissioning and cleanup of that site, aside from just containing the problems that we have there in reactors 1, 2, and 3 and reactor 4, which holds 1,500 individual assemblies of 12 rods each of this spent and new fuel that's in that cooling pond. It's a multifaceted problem that is, I don't want to be a fearmonger, but it is sobering beyond comprehension, the potential that we have for serious, serious problems there. Now, we had a complete meltdown in reactors 1, 2, and 3. All 3 of those reactors were GE Mark I nuclear reactors, which GE knew had a problem with their steam venting controls in those reactors. Those were known issues.
Now, this is a really good point because I saw something the other day where a gentleman by the name of Dale Breidenbau, I think he was an engineer for GE
Yes.
around July, and he was a much older gentleman. He had made a video, I think, personally talking about the potential flaws in that design, and I tried to click on that video, and it's been removed.
It's been removed. Yes.
And so were you able to watch that? And
I couldn't bring it up. I did see that. I'm kind of scanning the iPad here to see if I could find the link to it. That video was gone, but there was actually an article. There was an article back in Time magazine that I believe he was quoted in back in the day when he first blew the whistle on this issue, that there is a problem with the venting structures in those GE Mark I nuclear reactors, which I know we have many of those
in the United
around
States.
in the United States right now. So when the tsunami hit and when the power was cut and the overheating started, it wasn't able to just vent. It exploded. All 3 reactors melted down completely, and now they are pumping millions of gallons to try to keep them cool enough so they don't completely explode, go fissionable, and explode into the atmosphere right now. Storing that water is a huge problem. There's water running under those 3 reactors that's running into the ocean,
Right.
and that because there's been a complete meltdown underneath, that water is all contaminated. So the radiation levels in the Pacific near Fukushima is off the chart, and the air around it. If a human being got close enough just to take a measurement of the level of radiation, they would be dead before they got out. It is that toxic, that hot. Reactor 4 did not melt down. It was offline at the time the tsunami hit. What the public should understand is that nuclear reactors, and this is true for every reactor that we have in the United States, the spent fuel does not mean it's not radioactive anymore. It just means that it's not radioactive enough to boil water, to make steam, to make electricity. That nuclear material has got to be stored for 5 years while it cools down enough to be put into these cement casks and then be stored on site forever because we don't have a place to store our spent waste. Fukushima stored their spent fuel in the attic of the reactor building. All of those blue reactor buildings that you see in the pictures, the upper levels of those buildings stored pools where the spent fuel was kept. The building reactor 4 was damaged so badly by the earthquake that it is leaning. The fuel assemblies that are in that building, Arnie Gunderson described it as it's like a crushed pack of cigarettes, and trying to pull one out without touching or damaging any of the others in a crushed pack of cigarettes. Because if the is it zirconium cladding on the outside of these rods that are in the assemblies. So say you have 12 rods in an assembly and then there's 1,500 assemblies.
So if we use a cigarette analogy, it would be the paper that keeps that wraps around all of the
tobacco.
The tobacco.
Exactly. Okay. If that gets disrupted, if those things bang against each other and break, fission starts, the water boils, things explode, and if that happens, then it's estimated that we are looking at 14,000 Hiroshima bombs on that one spot, in that one building. And the impact on the West Coast would be horrific, at best, horrific. Now, I have been following it very, very closely. The other day, I was checking the news, and I get notice every time there's an earthquake over a 3-pointer anywhere in the world, I get an email, and there was a 5-pointer. They had a 5. And all I could do was just post, Oh, I hope they weren't moving an assembly. Please don't let them have been moving an assembly at that moment when that hit.
Right. And it's not just the earthquake that we have to worry about, because an earthquake can happen miles away.
Absolutely.
And it's the incoming wave or tsunami that could also have a significant impact. And my recollection is that that whole power plant wasn't even built on granite. It was built on a man-made shelf, which was basically a garbage pile, for lack of a better term, but it was basically just landfill that they put there in order to create something that they could build upon. So that's why that water coming off of that mountain behind it is seeping up underneath the plant, because it's not genuine rock below it.
Right.
And then it just takes whatever radioactive waste has burned through the ground
Right.
and just sloughs that right off into the ocean.
Right into the ocean, absolutely. Now, we have already seen radiation in bluefin tuna on the California coast.
100%, I think.
100% of the bluefin tuna on the California coast contains radiation traced to Fukushima. Those fish, bluefin, yellowfin, I think there's another one that actually make that cycle. Japan, north around Alaska, down the coast, and down around Hawaii and such. So that is a big, big problem. For those of you listening, if you're my age, I'm 60, chances are very slim that I'm going to have a severe impact from this, from eating fish. What you need to, although I am not going to eat fish, we need to be very careful about the salmon we get from Alaska, because Alaska's really getting hit by this radiation, and it gets that water first.
Well, those salmoners, they're going to get a double whammy, because not only are they being exposed to the genetically modified organisms that have been approved by the FDA,
That's right.
now they're getting hammered by radiation.
That's right.
That's a bummer. I like salmon.
I know. It's a big problem. It's a big problem. It's terrible. What you need to be very, very aware of is that if your children and your grandchildren eat this fish, they are very, very much more susceptible to those ionizing radiation particles than adults are.
And they're going to bioaccumulate too, based on their age.
Absolutely, based on their age. So be very, very careful about letting your children eat fish. And I don't think it's healthy for any of us to panic, but we need to be very, very aware and be very smart and not pretend it doesn't exist and not pretend this isn't happening. It is absolutely happening.
Well, panicking isn't going to do anything helpful.
Absolutely.
We just have to think
Absolutely.
strategically.
Absolutely. Now, fairwindsenergy.org, the website that is run by Arnie Gunderson, who is a nuclear engineer, had his operator's license, and has been in the industry for many, many years, and was a proponent of nuclear energy up until Fukushima, and is now a brilliant spokesperson on behalf of those of us who are not fans of nuclear. Every week, just about every week, he puts out a new video and an update on Fukushima. It's a wonderful resource. Fair Winds, F-A-I-R-E, Winds Energy Education. And Arnie is a wonderful, wonderful resource. He and his wife Maggie have done this for years, and we've been very lucky and have gotten very close, communicating a lot on this issue. He's very concerned, as we all are, that while this decommissioning and cleanup is happening at Fukushima, which I can't even say cleanup because they cannot clean it up. They are purely in trying to contain the damage right now. It will never be cleaned up. It's a horrific problem there. Japan is trying to, or has passed a law now, which is basically a press blackout on information.
Which is this kind of iron wall that I was...
Exactly.
And I think they're even considering prosecuting people who
Yes.
Try to share information
That's
under
correct.
like treasonous terms or something.
That's correct. So it is very possible that if they did have a problem there, we could go, who knows how long before we even hear about it.
Right.
And we do know that when the plants blew up, it took them weeks, multiples of weeks, to even tell the Japanese public that there had been meltdowns there. And when people evacuated, they had them evacuating into the radioactive plume. It was so disorganized and so horrible there, the way it was handled.
Well, recently there was another new snippet about naval officers and enlisted personnel on the USS Ronald Reagan,
Yes.
which was one of the first vessels to go in to assist with the immediate containment of the emergency.
That's
and
right.
It appears that many of those soldiers are now developing weird, rare
Yes, they
thyroid
are.
cancers, leukemia.
Leukemia, thyroid cancers, and brain cancers in our boys, the ones we sent in who were deployed on the USS Reagan, the first carrier to go in to try to assist after that tsunami. And now our boys are.
Now, do we understand? Was it water that the boat was taking in as far as its desalination equipment, and then circulated this radioactive water all around the ship? Do we have any idea?
They were showering in it, drinking it, exposed to it on the deck. It was over the top of them in the air. If they were out at sea, they were just exposed in all kinds of horrific ways to all of this radiation. I would absolutely lose what little is left of my ladylike qualities if I let loose on this issue. Protecting our children who are defending us and protecting our boys and taking them into a situation like that, knowing what we know, is unconscionable. Unconscionable. And if there is any discussion, if I hear anything about proving where those cancers came from, the way I did in my interview with the EPA, when I was asking them about the cancers around these uranium mines and why there were the levels of cancers and rare cancers specifically related to uranium and ionizing radiation exposure.
And they just gave you an asinine
He looked at me and he
justification.
said, "Really? Prove it."
Yeah.
That's what he said to me. So with our boys, with our children who are on those ships, I will be in Washington, D.C. I will go there, and I will make a big problem. I'll make it a big problem. And I know Elizabeth Kucinich will as well, my co-producer on the project.
Well, we'll talk a little bit about that in just a couple of minutes. I want to talk, because we're starting to close up the show, but there are some new mini nuclear power reactors and thorium. Can you talk about that?
I'm starting to learn about this thorium issue. Thorium is another brand of poison. It really is just another brand of poison. They say that it is safer because by changing the level of salt water in it and withdrawing it, that it goes offline and doesn't have the opportunity to explode and such. And I'm just starting to dig into it to build a knowledge base about exactly what it's going to do. The best I can say about a thorium reactor is that it might not kill you as fast.
Okay. Now, is it the same as these little nuclear mini power little reactors that are being built? Is that the underlying technology, or are those two different things?
Two different things.
Okay, because I've seen these new little mini reactors, which are about the size of, the trailer on a semi. They're about 40 feet long, and they can produce, maybe enough electricity to power a really small city. And they say you can and I think they're even being manufactured here in Oregon. One of our universities is actually pioneering the development of it.
And Bill Gates is behind that, too. He's helping. He's one of the investors in that. I am extremely disappointed in that. There is no safe level of radiation, period. If human beings could be perfect and error-free, and there was zero probability of there ever being any kind of human error associated with any of the critical parts manufacturing or operation in any of these reactors, then if we had that guarantee, we could all sleep at night and say, build them up, knock yourself out.
Right.
That will never, ever, ever happen. We cannot. If it's a manage of risk versus reward, if the nuclear companies want to say, yes, it can kill you, we will screw up. It will happen. You need to just place your bets that it won't happen in yours. It will happen in one of ours.
Well, I personally think that if the corporations that ran the nuclear reactors were actually held to the same legal responsibility that corporations were 100 years ago, then the leaders wouldn't take the risks that they are now. But it just seems like there's no legal liability because the U.S. government is footing the bill for almost all of it through
right.
taxpayer money. So there's no insurance company in the world that's willing to take on the risk of a nuclear reactor. So
Wall Street won't invest in nuclear. Wall Street will not invest in nuclear because they know how dangerous it is.
And they're risky anyway.
And they're stupid anyway. Seriously, I mean, it is a no-win scenario. Right. I'm doing. My husband and I are looking to do a remodel on our home here in Salem that we bought, and we're hoping to move up here permanently in the next year. And I contacted a solar company. I wanted to find out what it was going to take to try to help my energy usage here. And I found out that even though it's cloudy and gray, the new solar technologies can cut my usage at that place by estimated about 70%. Unbelievable.
Yeah, the new stuff is pretty good.
And that I could get into with the incentives that are currently in place, that I could get solar, my entire house, which is a big place, not fancy, don't get me wrong, but it is quite a bit of square footage in this older home, but that I could get into it for 20 years for under $5,000 and with all of the incentives and have it maintained and guaranteed and taken care of. And it was very impressive conversation. It was really, I was very impressed.
Wow.
On a downside, I did find out that the U.S. government just approved a $227 million grant to a company in Corvallis.
Is it Grants Pass?
No, Corvallis,
Okay.
I think, Nucor, for a nuclear plant in Portland that they want to have up and running by 2025. I have a big problem with that, and I'm going to be taking that on in a big way if I cannot imagine that Portland would allow a nuclear plant on the Willamette River or the Columbia. It's completely insane.
Have you ever heard of Safecast?
I have heard that name. What is it?
It's actually it's an organization which writes software and actually builds, I guess, little mini Geiger counters that have been placed all around the world.
Yes.
And this is essentially an open source project. And this allows, I actually downloaded the app for my iPhone last night and I started tootling around with it. And because I'm concerned, I want to be able to monitor and figure out on my own what the truth actually is, not what, the government is wanting me to believe or companies are wanting me to believe.
Right.
And so I downloaded the app. And basically what it does is it takes these hundreds or thousands of these little Geiger counter transponders, which are measuring radiation all around the world, and then streaming them back to a primary database. And then you get an app on your phone, so you can essentially move over anywhere in the world and look at what the radiation levels are in microsieverts per hour. Now,
Right.
It's dialed in right now automatically for Fukushima. So when you download it, I mean, that's kind of like where the impetus of it came from. But you can turn on GPS and you can dial it in for your own hometown. So
I had heard of another one. I thought it was called RadNet or something
And
that might
that-
be the same type of
well,
thing.
I heard of that and I started tracking it down. And from what I understand, that was EPA initiated.
Oh,
and it's been
okay.
taken internal again, I think. And I was trying to find that system. And then I came across this one. And this one is actually publicly run by a group, a whole worldwide group of basically open source programmers and circuit board designers who want to make this information available to humanity for doing better good.
Brilliant.
And so the little transponders actually cost quite a bit of money. They're several $100s, but there's been more than enough individuals that have purchased them and mounted them, and they're feeding data back. And I ran into something that was really, really peculiar yesterday because I just downloaded this app yesterday and I was just kind of awkward and muddling through it and trying to figure out how it worked. and I set the GPS location for Salem, and it honed in on my address, and then just it was by accident, unless you think it's by destiny, but I just inadvertently did a thumb stroke to the right, which moved the map to the left, and it panned out over the Willamette River, which is just west of Salem, right? It goes right down Salem and then goes west. And right around the Eola Hills area, it said there was a little verbiage, and I couldn't see it, so I zoomed in, and it said unnamed uranium source.
What?
And I looked at that, and I just paused for a minute, and I started thinking, what is that? And then I know we have some medical facilities over there, but I don't think they have any major like radioactive. I'm not sure if we have an oncology center out there or not. That might be one rationale. On the other hand, I don't think they use uranium, right? I think they use barium. Okay, but what I do remember is there's a mine on that side of the river in that area. And you don't see it until the wintertime when all of the trees shed their leaves, and you can look right across 22 past the Eola Hills restaurant where Rockin' Rogers is, over the Willamette River, and you see that mine out there. Now,
I am so checking this out.
Now, what's really interesting is that I had a business associate who developed osteosarcoma, who was literally on the opposite side of the bank. That's where his business was, just literally several hundred feet, down the Willamette River from where Eola Hills is.
Really?
And he developed this about 6 years ago. And fortunately, in osteosarcoma, especially the kind that he had, is about 95% terminal. He was able to overcome it. But here was the tragic thing. Right after that, maybe 2 years or so, there was a whole cluster of children in West Salem who all went to the same grade school, who ended up in high school. I think there were 3 or 4 of them, maybe even more at this point, that all developed osteosarcoma.
No.
Yeah.
Really?
And OHSU, which is Oregon Health Sciences University, was investigating, and there was no real definitive, understanding that it was epidemic or any of these things. But they also they weren't aware of my business associate who had developed it 2 years before in that same area. And I looked at that and I said, this is a low-level epidemic. Something's going on here. And it wasn't until last night where I looked at that map and I said, what is this?
What?
And then I scanned over all of Oregon, and there weren't any other locations that said unnamed uranium source except one down in Grants Pass area somewhere. So it wasn't common, right? And I even scanned the coast, and fortunately, the radiation levels in Oregon are actually pretty low, when you cover the entire state. And then I wanted to see how far the map would pan out. So I expanded it, and I expanded over into Colorado, and I expanded over into Nevada, and it lit up.
Yes.
Everywhere. It said unnamed uranium source, or it said mining. The whole, you couldn't even, I couldn't even see the state names because there were so many mines that were listed.
Absolutely.
And then
there are thousands and thousands of them. Abandoned mines.
Then I went over to Colorado, and I found the river. And I just put the little index over some areas of the river, and the microsieverts were like 20 to 60 times higher than what the standard is. So that was just like proof in the pudding. And so I've just been, just using this thing since last night, just figuring it all out. But just the concept that perhaps we do have a radioactive source in close proximity to Salem, especially West Salem, and the fact that we've had a cluster of osteosarcoma, which is bone cancer, and what is uranium associated with? Leukemia. What's leukemia? Bone cancer.
Yeah. My daughter went to elementary school over in West Salem. We lived in West Salem when she was a baby and my son was born. Wow. Okay, that's going to be my next project, and next time I come back, maybe I'll have a report for you. I've got a Geiger counter. I have the app. I have an app for that. And
Awesome.
the little attachment for my iPhone that's actually a Geiger counter. I have a couple of Geiger counters, and I might...
Well, we need to get a whole little kit put together.
Let's do a road trip. Let's go check this out.
I'm game. So in closing, because we're just about at the top of the hour, you had mentioned Elizabeth Kucinich.
Yes.
And so I know that this isn't your only documentary. I know you're thinking about doing some other things. So what else is on the horizon?
Oh my gosh. Well, we have a very exciting new documentary that we have started filming. We hope to have it done this next year, and it's actually a wonderful story about the Appalachian Trail and my brother and nephew who hiked the Appalachian Trail. In the midst of that, discovered that my nephew at 17 had a very, very rare brain cancer. Raised in Tennessee near Oak Ridge, and definitely environmental because it was a very, very rare brain cancer. So they broke from the trail, but ended up fighting this battle and climbing those mountains and valleys together through the battle of fighting this cancer, and then went back and finished the trail together. And it's an extraordinary story. For those who don't know about the Appalachian Trail, it's 2,200 miles from Georgia to Maine, and thousands of people start hiking the trail every year, and very few finish it.
Yeah.
And so it's a remarkable story of struggle and faith and getting through.
Perseverance.
Oh, unbelievable. I can't run to the bathroom, so hiking the Appalachian Trail is just crazy. I mean, doing the mall at Christmas, forget it. This is just nuts that they were able to do this. It was just nuts. So I'm just speechless. But our other projects, we're looking at another project about drug addiction and the effect on newborn babies, and a lot of issues like that relating to women's issues, health issues, children's issues, and nutrition. Elizabeth just finished, we just finished project on GMOs, the film GMO OMG, which Elizabeth was a producer on, and I helped in the background with the production. So we're very excited about it. Our nonprofit organization, the Hestia Foundation, helps fund it. So donations, of course, are welcome, but that's certainly not the point. But
Right. Okay, so when again does Hot Water come out?
let's see. We are looking for probably an April theatrical release. Probably sometime around Earth Day.
Okay.
We were hoping to make it March 11th, the anniversary of Fukushima.
Right.
We probably aren't going to make it. So we're going to shoot for probably the latter half of April for a theatrical release. And then shortly after that, it'll be available video on demand, Netflix, Amazon, Redbox, hopefully on cable, Stars, HBO, and so on.
For our listeners who are interested, then go to www.zerohotwater.com.
That's right. ZERO, hotwater.com is the website. You can see the trailer, and you can get a lot of information. We just debuted the new website, and we're trying to make it a clearinghouse for information on what's going on worldwide with uranium mining. And we're adding territories all the time. But
Great. Great. Well, and also for the listeners, Safecast is actually www.safecast.org. And I think you
I'm
can
going to go on there right now.
Yeah, you can actually go to the iPhone or the iStore and actually just look up Safecast and download the app. And it's about 100 megabytes, so you need, I think, a Wi-Fi connection to do it. So, well, Liz, it's been fantastic having you on the show again today.
I'm so lucky to have met you. I really am so
well,
blessed.
Likewise.
Oh, it's been just terrific. I'm so honored, and I'd be here every day. I love a captive audience.
Yeah, you'll have to come and visit. We love having your participation.
Thank you.
So, well, that's it. You've done it again. You've spent another hour listening to New Health Radio on KMUZ 88.5 FM. I'm your host, Nate Darnell. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to email us, at New Health Nation, that's spelled N-U, Health Nation, at gmail.com. And tune in again next week for the next brain-swelling, eye-glazing edition of New Health Radio between the hours of 1 and 2. Until then, this is Nate Darnell wishing you well.